Hello and welcome to the STEM Ecosystems Community of Practice Policy Practice Group web meeting. We are bringing you presentations from the U.S. Department of Education and also from one of our key partners in policy who has consulted with us over time and want to share some insights and information. So thank you so much for joining us today. This is Angela Baber, Senior STEM Consultant with TIES and also the Executive Director of Lead STEM, a professional development program for ecosystem leaders. And I'll walk us through what you can expect from us for the next hour, and then we'll move to our list of wonderful presenters. Some logistics: we are recording this web meeting. If you have questions, please note those and we'll take those after our presenters have presented. The chat function is a place where you can enter your questions anytime throughout. We have Veronica Gonzalez, who is joining us, who will help to facilitate the question and answer process. And at the end of the presentations, we are also able to unmute presenters if needed, if you would actually like to ask questions out loud. So just let us know. So with that, our meeting objectives today really are to hear from our partners, our supporters, our funders from STEM Next Opportunity Fund regarding their investments that they've made, specifically in regards to the Department of Education. So we're happy to have Teresa Drew joining us, and we'll hear from her in a moment. We'll also learn more from Patti Curtis at the U.S. Department of Education in regards to STEM priorities. And we will hear from Della Cronin in regards to additional priorities that are not covered specifically in terms of the Department of Education. And then we want an opportunity to hear from you, your questions, your thoughts, your work. We'll save a bit of time at the end for that. So our agenda follows our objectives. You can see here we'll have a good chunk of time, about 20 minutes at the end, for open sharing and Q&A. And we have a good amount of time for presentations for our partners that are on the line. With that, I would like to turn this over to Teresa Drew, the Associate Director of STEM Next Opportunity Fund. Many of you know her quite well. She is one of the thought partners and co-creators of the Global STEM Learning Ecosystem Initiative and has been a really wonderful, amazing partner over a number of years. So, Teresa, we're so happy to have you, and let me turn this over to you.
Oh, thank you, Angela. That was very, very kind words, so thank you. And I want to thank the entire TIES team for organizing this webinar today. Again, my name is Teresa Drew. I'm the Associate Director of STEM Next Opportunity Fund. And on behalf of STEM Next and Ron Ottinger, our Executive Director, and also the founding co-chair of the STEM Learning Ecosystem Initiative, I'd like to welcome you all to today's conversation and thank you for your time and your commitment to STEM learning. As many of you know, STEM Next aims to get more kids inspired and excited about STEM. We focus primarily in the out-of-school learning space because we believe that when kids participate with their peers in a non-competitive environment led by caring adults that they can relate to, they get turned on to STEM, they get more engaged at school, and they consider careers that they never dreamed of before. We focus particularly on low-income youth, kids of color, and young girls, investing in high-quality programming that will launch kids into STEM pathways by igniting their curiosity, sparking their interest, and engaging their minds. To accomplish this goal, our approaches are varied. Primarily, we have 3 different approaches. We invest in organizations and ideas that are innovative and often groundbreaking that provide high-quality STEM learning. We build and support networks that can scale ideas quickly and opportunities broadly. The STEM learning ecosystem is an example of this type of approach. And finally, we support efforts that increase STEM awareness and value broadly to advise, educate, and advocate for public investment in STEM. The Robert Noyce Ellen Lettvin Informal STEM Fellow is an example of this approach. In partnership with the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, and this was launched initially in 2014, and in collaboration with the U.S. Department of Education, we have established the Robert Noyce, now Robert Noyce Ellen Lettvin Informal STEM Fellow. This past January, Patti Curtis, who you'll all talk with shortly, was named the Robert Noyce Ellen Lettvin Informal STEM Fellow, succeeding our dear friend Ellen Lettvin, who passed away a little over a year ago. We could not be more thrilled to have Patti on the team and lifting up STEM every day at the Department of Education. Prior to her fellowship, Patti led the policy efforts for the Museum of Science Boston for over a decade. Some of her many accomplishments include working with Congress to design several bills in support of K-12 engineering education, as well as the inclusion of several provisions within the America Competes Act and Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA. She helped to secure technology and engineering language in the National Assessment Education Progress Science and Technology Engineering Literacy Assessment, as well as the Next Generation Science Standards. She served on the STEM Education Congressional Caucus Steering Committee and the Title IV Coalition Steering Committee. Patti co-chaired the STEM Education Coalition and received the Aztec Ray L. Schaefer Leading Edge Award for her leadership in policy and advocacy. You can see why we are so thrilled to have Patti working with the Department of Ed on STEM education for us. In the short 5 months since the fellowship began, Patti is fast becoming the STEM champion and authority within the department. Patti is not only championing STEM within the department, but her external facing work connects the STEM ecosystem and others to the Department of Ed and other federal agencies and programs, including opportunities for funding from the various agencies. On behalf of STEM Next, I am pleased to introduce you all to my friend and colleague, Patti Curtis, the Robert Noyce and Ellen Lettvin Informal STEM Education Fellow. I hope you all can just understand and see how important Patti's work is to all of ours, and how important she's been to STEM Next, the STEM education field broadly. And just again, thank you, Patti. Thank you, Ty's team, for arranging this. And Della, also, you're championing our work as well. So we are, all of us, a team together. Thank you all.
Thank you, Teresa. That was very warm and kind and overwhelming. I'm really very grateful to STEM Next and the Charles A. Mott Foundation for this opportunity. I have spent over 20 years as an advocate for STEM education. Oh, I'll turn my camera on so hopefully you can see me. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so I've been a STEM advocate for over 20 years in the DC area. I previously worked for the American Society of Mechanical Engineers and, as Teresa mentioned, the Museum of Science Boston. And I've been really focused on sort of the E in STEM, but STEM, writ large and, in a lot of areas, right, with respect to standards or assessments, curricula, professional development, and policy. So I'm really grateful to be here now working in the Department of Ed. We really don't have a STEM office as and past administrations. So I'm hoping to sort of recreate some of the activities that were underway, yes, like under, for instance, the Obama administration. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that I'm doing now here at the department. So we can switch slides. So there's my email address. Please take note of that. If you have questions or you would like to receive my little STEM newsletter, I'd be happy to add you to my list. And yes, I did meet the secretary the other day. She bought donuts for everybody, donuts and coffee. It was in the lobby, and I think it was during Teacher Appreciation Week. So I was able to first introduce myself and talk about the sponsors and also our mission to support effective and efficient after-school STEM programs and K-12 as well. So I came to the department just about mid-January, and the White House and the Office of Science, Technology Policy had just released their 5-year STEM plan. On the outside of the government, I had submitted comments, I think, as well as others perhaps on the call, in order to have that plan reflect some of the good things that were happening in the ecosystems, in informal STEM, in museums, in classrooms. And so when that plan came out, basically it was a call to action, not only for the federal agencies, which is probably the primary target, but also for states and stakeholders nationwide. And it's been interesting in the few trips I've had since I started. A lot of the states are taking this seriously and incorporating some of the activities and actions that are outlined in the plan into their own STEM plans. So that's interesting. I'll mention the Secretary STEM priority, talk about some of the communications that I'm working on, trying to, as I mentioned, sort of kickstart an internal STEM function within the department, and then also working closely with the 21st Century Community Learning Center program. There are funds called national activities that support this block grant to the states or formula grant to the states. And we are partnering with some very science-rich mission agencies to enhance activities for children in after-school programs. So I'll dig deep a little bit more as we progress. Next slide, please. So for those of you that are not aware, if you were not able to attend the last webinar from the White House and OSTP, this is the 5-year plan, charting a course for success, America's strategy, not a federal strategy, not a national strategy, America's strategy. And that word was chosen specifically to imply that everyone could take advantage of the suggestions in the plan. So next slide. The 3 goals of the plan are outlined here, building strong foundations that really looks at K-12 and out-of-school science, STEM, and then preparing the workforce, really looking at sort of the next steps for students after school, and then finally and always increasing diversity and equity and inclusion in STEM fields and opportunities. And this is what they call the dot chart, and it outlines the 3 pathways that we are charged with pursuing. And as I think Jan has made very clearly known, that STEM ecosystems is one of the first objectives in the plan, and that really is to build what you're building in your own communities, to bring all stakeholders together to bear not only on needs, but what they can bring to the table. And then the second pathway where students converge is kind of interesting to me, and how we can really make STEM an integrated opportunity for learning. And you'll see a variety of objectives under that pathway as well. And then finally, there's a huge focus on building computational literacy. As you all know, that just the capacity in this country is really insufficient to bring our students up to par for, creating and building the next generation of the internet. And all fields really depend on some form of software, and we also need people that are able to secure that software. So those are really the 3 big pathways. As you can see, there are several objectives, and then within the objectives, there's several actions that the federal government has been asked to take. So the first couple months really, and you can see Department of Ed signed up for every one of those objectives. So the first thing I had to do was really survey my colleagues here and find out what programs were they operating that followed those different actions. So it helped me learn who's doing what. And yeah, so that was a good bit of it. And now OSTP has taken all the federal agencies that were listed there together to generate what they're calling an implementation plan. And there will be a public-facing document released that will sort of highlight some of the things that we're doing at the federal level that are exemplars of those particular actions. And then, yeah, I guess if you want to go to the dot chart is probably where I'm at now. Back up a little bit, please. Yeah, there. So the implementation plan will come out, and that'll serve as sort of, I wouldn't say best practices, but perhaps bright spots that the federal government is doing to implement on these objectives. So hopefully that will provide some suggestions as it is implemented in other locations, other states, or other jurisdictions. So that's consumed a good bit of my time, but it was very helpful in learning who's doing what here in the department. A very big agency, as you can imagine. So that's number one. Let's go to number two, or the next slide, I'm sorry. That's, if you haven't heard, the Secretary initiated a number of priorities, as have other administrations, and STEM was one of the 11 that were approved and are now being utilized across the agency with respect to mostly discretionary grants. As you can imagine, the formula grants are driven by statute, and so you know, we can provide some technical assistance and guidance to grantees, mostly the state education agencies that receive the funds. But this STEM priority, you will see very heavily used in what we call discretionary grants, where the Secretary, through statute, has pots of money, which we call oftentimes national activities or technical assistance, that we can do some experimentation, and we offer competitive grants. So this STEM priority has been very widely used, and especially the focus on computer science as well. So we can go to the next slide. So these are some of the current funding opportunities that have arisen or come out of the department since I started. EIR is Education, Innovation, and Research, and that application period just ended, and I'm now serving as a panel monitor. We have hundreds of applications and hundreds of peer reviewers, and the departmental staff will manage that peer review panel, or peer review system, and then that will be concluded June 13th, and then there will be another level of review, and the announcements will be made thereafter. So that's kind of the process. I'm learning a lot about the steps with respect to creating a grant and administering a grant. So sometimes it takes an entire year to do one grant. So there are teams that are specific to each grant. The TQP is the Teacher Quality Partnership, and that, as well as the EIR, had priorities. One was the STEM priority, and then the second was computer science competitive preference, which means they could actually get 5 additional points on top of, say, 100 if they were addressing computer science. So as I said, we're just starting to review some of the EIR grants, and there were, I think, a very good response to the STEM priority and the competitive preference for computer science. TQP similarly had a STEM preference. Those were just completed, or just the submissions were just finalized or received May 20th. I don't have any data on that with respect to how many were STEM related, but I can certainly share that once we get that sort of data back. The other thing that the grants are doing, and you don't really see it in the Secretary's priorities, but the President issued a executive order on rural communities. So in addition to the STEM priorities, there's often a layer of, or a set aside for rural communities and schools, up to 25% of the total funds if we receive sufficient grants of caliber. And you can see the dollar amounts for these particular grants. The JAVITS program, for those that are unaware, is targeting students sort of in advanced academics, or used to be called gifted and talented. But these are, it actually had been unfunded for a couple of years, maybe even a decade, and it was refunded a couple of years ago, and these are mostly research grants around, you know, best ways to serve those students. And then the CTE I&M grant is also a new grant. It's Career Tech Ed Innovation and Modernization grants. It's a small grant, but it's available to local school districts that might be doing something really innovative with respect to career and tech ed. I was out in Oregon at the Oregon Ask STEM Summit, and one of their CTE schools was introducing a drone program. So I thought that was pretty clever, and you know, versus sort of just auto shop or some of the more standard CTE programs. So those grants are due in June 4th. There was, I think, about 2 months lead time on that one. So hopefully some of the folks in your communities are taking a look at that, and that we can, you know, get some really great results from that, and we can share further. Next slide. So the internal STEM plan, this is still up for approval, I guess, but I've crafted a couple of ideas about how we can, as Teresa mentioned, elevate STEM within the department. I do feel like there's still a lot of support for STEM, not only because of the secretary's priority, but just, you know, knowing that this is what kids need for their futures. So I'm trying to introduce like a STEM newsletter that I mentioned, but to formalize it a bit more and gather more data or more input from other departments. There's also a new rural newsletter managed by a colleague of mine, and they are seeking content. So if you have some exciting stories from rural communities, again, you can share them with me, and I'd be happy to send those over to the rural newsletter. We also have a youth engagement newsletter that has been sort of stagnant for a while, and we similarly are looking for news articles on that. So I think, you know, maybe some stories from after-school programs or other, you know, great CTE programs would be really interesting. So yeah, our communications really could use a shot in the arm, and working with some of the new folks that have come on board to try to do that. Similarly, the department, we try to do STEM briefings for staff because, you know, as with anyone gets really involved in their day-to-day jobs, they don't always get to look sort of from the outside in. So we're trying to organize some briefings around sort of cool initiatives. Maybe it's a technology or it's some other unique professional development or other research around the science of learning. Yesterday we had one on executive function and equity. Clearly those are gaps there that need to be addressed. And then also just, you know, conducting a bunch of interagency meetings, trying to get to know everybody here, and engaging with some of my the other colleagues across other agencies, particularly NSF and NASA, NOAA, and I'll dip into that a little bit more. And then finally, I think one thing I've kind of realized now that I'm serving as or in a bureaucracy like this, is that, you know, Congress, people wanted, or the states wanted more flexibility with respect to education policy, but then there's always this demand for accountability and efficacy and efficiency, but yet the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, is really strict on how much burden you can put on recipients with respect to data collection. So it's kind of a conundrum I'm finding quite interesting, but there are measures that are used for reporting called GEPRA, Government Performance and Review Act measures, and we do try to take a look at those and make sure that they're actually measuring the outcomes we'd like to see. And some of them are old, and some of them really need to be revised. So that's a whole nother process, and I am engaging in some of that too. And so the next slide, please. So the one project that my dear predecessor, Ellen, I have to give her a shout out as well. Everyone that I've met that knew Ellen really adored her, and so I feel like I have really big shoes and a really big heart to fill in her space. She, you know, operated across a lot of interagency STEM activities, but within the department, she was really the spark plug behind this new activity called well, it's not very sexy, the 21st CCLC IAAs, or interagency agreements. And as I mentioned, with this formula grant, there's a line item for national activities funds, and she was really able to capture that opportunity and develop partnerships and pilots with these 4 science mission agencies, NASA, NOAA, IMLS, and the National Park Service. And they did some pilot outreach where their content and their providers or PD providers would work with various sites of after-school programs. And this block grant really focuses on, on underserved or low-income communities. And these content experts would come in and work with the on-site educators to make sure that, they were able to offer rich STEM experiences. And these different agencies have kind of come up with different niche experiences. And they actually had evaluation funding as well, not just implementation funding or development and implementation. So they feel like, I think this is the 3rd round and the largest grants given prior to the pilots or after the pilots. And so they're really excited about delivering sort of a quality product, not only for the students, but for the on-site educators, that they feel comfortable bringing STEM, not only during the grant period, but thereafter. And then the next slide. I think that might be all for me. So if you have more questions about the existing grants, I'm happy to try to respond to those. I do know that we have 4 more competitive grants coming out before the end of the fiscal year, which is September. This year, the Department of Ed was funded even during the shutdown. As Della knows, usually the Department of Ed is one of the last departments to get their funding. So they've really made a concerted effort to get our grants out in a much timelier fashion. And yeah, so we'll have 4 more, and definitely those will be announced in the STEM newsletter. And I think I've probably used my time. I have other things I could talk about, but I want Della to have her time.
No, you have at least 5 more minutes. So if you have
I do
to share, Patti. Yeah.
Okay, great. I wasn't doing a good job timing. So where I physically sit is in the Office of Educational Technology, and my colleagues there just did a presentation on some of the work they're doing to address the fact that educational technology is ever present in many of our classrooms, and how can we be of assistance to schools and teachers trying to make decisions around buying ed tech and using ed tech. So one of the projects is called Education Technology Spotlights, and they have created a framework of 9 criteria that would help in sort of that decision-making or decision-making buying process. And those will be released at the upcoming NSTA conference, and then we'll certainly post them, far and wide, and we'll have some additional blogs following up on some of the best practices that they found across the country. So hopefully that will help inform teachers and principals, et cetera, in looking at technology in a new light with some frameworks. I did hear something recently about Donors Choose, right? We all know teachers use Donors Choose to buy stuff for their classroom. Well, some of them were buying ed tech and equipment and able to do that, and then some districts were kind of shutting them down because they said, we can't support what you're buying. If you're going to buy something, it has to follow this framework. So I'm hoping that the framework that we've crafted with a variety of experts is helpful in that process. A second thing that ed tech team is working on is enhancing broadband access to communities that don't currently have that. And so I think the FCC currently has is contemplating a new auction of spectrum space, and we at the department are hoping to at least demand that they retain a portion of that at a low cost for educational institutions, whether it's the LEA, a community college, a library, or a university, so that schools in those areas that are unserved still can afford that. And then finally, our higher ed team is working on sort of blockchain options for student records. So as you can imagine, if I needed to get my transcript today, it'd be pretty difficult, and it probably would, might be on yellowed paper. And this is an opportunity for students to take ownership of their learning process and their credentials, be it a community college or a credentialed program through industry, university. If they go in and out of school or they cross states, it would be very easy for them to take these sort of electronic, certified and digital records with them. So that's kind of an interesting concept going forward, because, I mean, no one should really own your transcript by yourself, frankly. And then the other thing I could announce is that the college scorecard was just updated and released yesterday. And this is an opportunity for students and parents and counselors to take a look at sort of the return on investment for degrees that they might choose, for schools that they might choose. I don't have an opinion on it. I haven't used it yet, but I think it is something that provides more resources for students as they contemplate a career, a college degree. So that's all I have for now.
Patti, thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to share with us. We really appreciate all of this good information. As I mentioned, for those of you on the line who have questions, please just note those now. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next presenter. And if we run out of time today, we will in some way coordinate and make sure, as we did with the last web meeting, to get answers and responses back out to you in some form or another. So,
right.
Patti, again, really, really appreciate you and your role, and we're very thankful and grateful to STEM Next Opportunity Fund for supporting this important role at the Department of Education. So thank you so much for your time, and please stay with us for questions in a bit.
Yeah, it's been 4 months out of the two-year gig, so hopefully I'll have some more exciting things to share in the future.
Excellent, thank you. With that, Della, I would love to introduce you. For those of you who do not know Della Cronin with Bose Washington Partners, she has, again, as Patti has been for over a number of years, a co-collaborator, a co-conspirator, a wonderful thought partner, and just an expert in terms of policy, in terms of STEM education, particularly at the federal level. We are lucky to have her as a partner and as a consultant in this work. And with that, Della, can I turn this over to you?
Of course, thanks so much. So thanks to Patti for her update as well. So I learned some new things listening to her, and I'm sure folks on the phone did as well. Sounds like there's a lot going on over in the executive branch. I'm going to talk mostly about what's going on in the legislative branch. So I think we're probably going to cover 2 of our 3 branches of government pretty well today, and what they're up to or want to be up to in terms of STEM education. Similar to Patti's first 4 months at the Department of Education, we are coming around, I guess, our first 5 months of the 116th Congress. I think you all know that this has been a turbulent time in Washington, D.C. The first part of this congressional session was marked by a government shutdown, which sort of put everybody on an odd footing to start with. But I think we're sort of hitting our pace now in terms of folks who have been involved in congressional activity for some time. Some of the activities that have been going on in the last 6 to 8 weeks are more familiar as the House and Senate try to do the work of the people. So I'm going to talk about what the Congress is doing or hopes to do that the STEM education community is and should be paying attention to. Let's get started. So As is the case every year, the STEM community, the after-school community, the CTE community, every education and research advocacy community is paying attention to the spending debate, because every year Congress debates what sort of spending they're going to do on education, as well as research and development, and those are important investments to STEM education broadly. This Congress is also taking on higher education as it's an education centerpiece. Like the Education and Labor Committee in the House and the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee in the Senate are both pretty focused on that, as is the broader education community, as that is sort of what's up next, since Perkins was last Congress and ESSA was the Congress before that. There's a conversation about infrastructure broadly. There was a meeting this morning at the White House, and if you have as many alerts on your phone as I do, it didn't go very well about infrastructure generally. But regardless of what's happening today, this Congress is, and in particular, Mr. Scott, who's the chair of the Education and Labor Committee, has been raising the issue of infrastructure investments in education that not only improve the facilities that students are going to every day, but also the proposal that he has would address access to technology, which is important, of course, to STEM education, and an issue that we've been struggling with in urban and rural areas as a community. There's a lot of talk about how to encourage and protect women and minorities in STEM education as well as STEM professions. We are, as a community, looking to the implementation of the Perkins Career and Technical Education Act update that was passed last Congress. And then we are all sort of still trying to figure out what the new ESSA law means for all the things that we care about in K-12 education, including STEM and after school and other things. So what's going on right now? So we're talking about education investments. Over in just the last couple of weeks, the House, which is moving first on the FY 2020 debate around education, has unveiled its bill. The areas of concern for the STEM education community have been Title II, which is money that goes to states to support professional development for K-12 teachers and teacher leaders. Title IV Part A, which is that new program from ESSA that's a formula grant to states and then formula to districts to be used flexibly, including investments in STEM education and education technology. And then we've been watching these other programs that, the more we do research on what works in STEM education, we know that there are other pockets of investments that are important to the growing STEM education programs across the country. Those include after school, early childhood education, social and emotional learning. All of those programs have gotten increases in the bill that was passed by the House. After school got an increase, Title IV Part A got an increase, Title II, which is the professional development, got an increase, which I think is a message that House Democrats want to send to their colleagues in the Senate as well as the White House, that they think these programs are important. They're rejecting the cuts that were proposed by the President and the White House in their budget request for 2020. And in particular, the social and emotional learning community might be characterized as the big winners in the House bill, because there's a new investment of almost $300 million in social and emotional learning that's sort of peppered through other existing programs. I think there's some more detail on that bill in a successing slide, so we'll return to that as well. And then research investments. I think we all know that the U.S. is falling behind other countries in their research and development investments as a percentage of GDP. Last year, there was $152 billion invested across the federal agencies in research and development, which was an increase over the previous year. And we're talking about research as it affects STEM education. Young people who participate in research on higher ed campuses are being trained to be contributors in a technical workforce. I think that's something that folks on Capitol Hill are very aware of and increasingly aware of. And then there is a conversation on Capitol Hill about connecting industry needs to research and development investments at the federal level. There's been a couple of hearings on that so far this year. So as I said, the big issue in the education policy world this year is the Higher Education Act. It's a really big piece of legislation. It's very complicated. It's politically fraught. It makes ESSA look easy in terms of the many different issues that it affects and the many different politics that play out in the debate of the bill. A lot of those debates are around student debt. You can see the cartoon here sort of speaks to the $1.4 trillion in student loan debt that the bill affects, and that probably affects just about everybody on the phone in terms of you either have debt yourself or know someone who does or is supporting someone who's taking it on. And that affects STEM education in that we care about getting people to and through college and having the resources that they need to do that. But the STEM education community sort of plays around in some smaller portions of that bill in terms of presenting its interests. One of those is retaining support for colleges of education, which in the Higher Education Act is in Title II of that law. There's a program there that called the Teacher Quality Partnership Program that Patti mentioned earlier that has a STEM and computer science priority in this year's competition. We think that's important, particularly in STEM education and the STEM teaching workforce, because there's so many changes in the STEM subjects that are being taught at the K-12 level. I think computer science has really, the computer science community has really highlighted this need in terms of the call for more computer science teachers, but it also affects engineering as well as math, science, and technology broadly. And then, of course, when we talk about this and we talk about these laws that persist for 10 years or longer, there are probably some subjects on the horizon that we're going to want in K-12 education that we don't even know about. And so we're hopeful as a community that that program can react to the needs of the workforce by creating new STEM teaching professions, but then also sort of giving incentives to colleges of education, which are not known for being speedy in terms of changing to produce the STEM teaching workforce that we need right away. Another big issue in the conversation around the Higher Education Act is support for minority serving institutions, or MSIs. That's found in Title III of that law. I don't think that people realize that there are 700 minority 2- and 4-year minority serving institutions that educate almost 30% of all U.S. undergraduates, and also a fifth of STEM bachelor's degree holders. A lot of, particularly the historically Black colleges and universities and the other minority serving institutions that get specific funds from this law, were really created to grow to grow minority populations in engineering, medicine, other STEM fields, and their role in that pursuit is quite important. And this law in supporting that pursuit is quite important. So the STEM community is watching that conversation quite closely as well. We need strong federal student aid programs to, as I said, to get students to and through college. There's some specific teaching assistance programs that are important to the STEM teaching workforce as well that we're watching. And then supports for students while they're on campus. There's a very healthy conversation going on about what do we need to give to students on 4-year campuses to be successful in STEM programs. Undergraduate research programs give them hands-on experience that's helpful and engaging them further in those critical first and second years of STEM degrees and getting them excited about staying in those programs or going further than they originally planned. What sort of counseling can be helpful to folks who are in STEM undergraduate programs? Near peer programs seem to be quite effective in terms of keeping young people in STEM programs, educating them about what sort of finances they're going to need to get through college. There's also, there's been a program at Georgia Southern that's getting a lot of attention on Capitol Hill about using predictive analysis to support their students. So if a student comes in with a C average in their college level mathematics and they're enrolled in a STEM program, what does the school need to be looking for at that student to make sure that they don't feel discouraged? Do they need extra help in math? Do they need a person from their hometown to talk to them about what they need to do to be successful in college? They're being quite creative and innovative in terms of trying to figure out how to get those students through college, and that's not it's not a purely charitable effort. There is some self-interest in making sure that these schools have healthy graduation rates and that their students leave with the skills they need to perhaps pay off some of the student loan debt that they've incurred. But these are all conversations that are happening in the higher education debate that the STEM community is paying attention to. I mentioned earlier that we're talking about infrastructure in a different way. We want to make sure that schools are safe and that they provide access to technology for K-12 students so that they're wired for access, that their community is able to provide Wi-Fi, perhaps on the school bus on the way home for students who need access to do their homework. We're having those sorts of conversations. We're also worried about institutions of higher education and their access to current technologies, lab equipment, buildings, again, even Wi-Fi at that level. And then again, equitable access to broadband in rural and urban areas. And there's been some interesting conversations and strategies to including parking in Wi-Fi enabled school buses in poorer neighborhoods over the weekend so that students can have access to Wi-Fi. Those conversations are going on in the infrastructure debate. And then with the flip in the leadership in the House, there's been this increased attention on women in STEM fields. For those who have been in this game for a while, you'll know that Mrs. Eddie Bernice Johnson, who's the chair of the House Science Committee, has always been a voice for increased diversity in STEM, but also making sure that women feel safe and protected on campus and in the workplace. And she's introduced a number of bills on that topic to make sure that women feel safe, supported in education programs and also on the job. So what's the latest? So I mentioned that we're in the midst of the FY 2020 appropriations bill. The House Appropriations Committee has passed a bill that would increase funding at the Department of Education by $4 billion. The big wins and the ones that mention STEM or STEAM or computer science specifically include increases for the Title IV Part A program. And then Patti mentioned the EIR program, the Education Innovation and Research Competitive Grant Program, which is really where the STEM and computer science program, a priority is played out in the FY19 process. There's what we call report language, which is guidance from the Congress to the Department of Education about what they think a program should focus on during the fiscal year. The report language for the EIR program in the FY20 bill, again, it increases the funding for the EIR program to $300 million from $125 million this year. This year, this year, the set aside for STEM and computer science is $60 million. In FY 2020, if this bill gets approved and signed, which is always a big if, it would be $125 million. It's worth noting that the A in STEAM has been added to that report language. So it would be science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. And I know there are some folks who really love the A, and there's some folks who don't care for it that much, and there are some folks who are indifferent about it, but it's in there. But the overall funding level increase is quite encouraging and exciting for the STEM field. We also see increases in research and development at the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, other research agencies that are included in the Commerce Justice Science Bill, which was just passed by the House Appropriations Committee today. There's a couple question marks, and there always are, and I think this morning raised a few more in terms of what's going to happen as the House and Senate need to figure out how to work together on a whole slew of issues and get the president bills that he can sign or will sign. there's the Senate action on the Labor, Health and Human Services and Education bill, which is where the Department of Education gets its funds from, is expected in early to mid-June, so after they get back from the Memorial Day recess. But the overall budget needs to still be decided. There still is not an agreement on what the top line spending numbers would be. The House has just decided what they think they should be and has proceeded on that count. The Senate, which is controlled by Republicans, would like to see a much lower number. Mr. McConnell and Mrs. Pelosi met this week on this topic, and it seemed to be an encouraging meeting where they thought they could reach a deal on the budget pretty quickly. I don't know what this morning's shenanigans will do to that intention, because it's hard to say when there's breaking news every 10 to 20 minutes how they're going to affect the ability of Republicans and Democrats to work together on any one thing. So TBD on that. And while all this is happening, there have been a number of bills, and if you've been on calls with me or others in recent years, these will look familiar. The Building Blocks of STEM Act just was approved by the Senate Commerce Committee last week. That passed the House last year, but never made it to the Senate or to the President's desk. That bill would encourage young women to get interested in computer science, and would also ask the National Science Foundation to do some research on early childhood education in STEM. There's the STEM Opportunities Act, which is about increasing STEM opportunities for young women on college campuses. 21st Century STEM for Girls and Underrepresented Minorities Act, the Computer Science for All. These are familiar. The Makers Act is a new one that would ask the National Science Foundation to do some research on how makerspaces are affecting STEM education. But these are all bills that have been introduced by some new champions for STEM on Capitol Hill and have varying chances of getting across the finish line. I would put the Building Blocks of STEM Act at the head of the chances for being enacted sometime during this Congress. And that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much. I always learn more and more every time I hear you speak, and really appreciate all of the information and letting us have a little bit of a purview into that legislative side of things as well. We do only have a few minutes left, but let me start by asking Veronica if there are any questions that came across in the chat function. So I'll give you a moment to look and to gather those. And I would offer if there are any questions that people would like to ask now. We probably have time for 1, 2, maybe 3 questions, and then we will find a way if there are additional questions to address those post-webinar. So Veronica, can I turn it over to you, please?
Of course. Thanks, Angela. And thank you to Della and Patti for your great presentations and all of this information. There are a few sort of logistical questions that I think perhaps we'll cover offline. So a few folks asked about links to the page hosting the different grant opportunities covered, and more information about how we can get connected with Patti's newsletters. I will also note, all of the things that Della mentioned, her updates through Bose. Those are the policy updates that we continuously post on the policy practice group website. So you have access to Della's updates, and we'll make sure to get you connected with some of the things that Patti discussed. So the first, I'll mention maybe both questions, and we can go in order. So the first, I think, is for Patti about the activities, how to access the activities made through the 21st Century Community Learning Center. This also might be a logistic question, but if there's a short answer to it, we can move to the next one.
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry. About the
how do you access the activities made through the 21st Century Community Learning Center?
Yeah. So we have, I guess it's called a technical assistance website called Y for the number 4, Y. So it's U for youth. That's what it stands for. y4y.ed.gov. And then on the upper right-hand corner, you'll see STEM activities. and that's where all the pilot information has been uploaded for the 4 different agencies. And NASA's agency agreement was actually cleared or confirmed in October. So they've already been doing outreach to the state education agencies, which then in turn solicit the 21st century learning sites within their state to determine whether they're eligible and capable of participating in the NASA activity. So if you're interested in the NASA program, definitely take a peek at that. I think they've uploaded their websites with respect to, how to apply, what's, expected of the site, and they are actively seeking sites. I think actually they may already have over 300 sites that have signed up that, that NASA has the capacity of handling. But the status of the IMLS, which will be doing maker activities, I believe that was just approved last week. We haven't really announced anything. I'm working on that. And then the next one in the queue is with NOAA, and they'll be doing, as you can imagine, environmental education and watershed experiences. And each one of them will have, a similar process where they will solicit participants through the state education agency that manages those federal dollars. And then the last one in the queue is the National Park Service. And I always think of the great big parks out west when I think of National Park Service, but there are lots of historical homes and other facilities that, are not just out, sort of in remote areas. There are places that are, more readily accessible. So I'm interested to see how that plays out. And I'm hoping to create sort of a map or whatever, just so we can see where all these are taking place.
Great, thank you so much, Patti. And I think we're probably going to end up following up with you on a few different logistic questions in terms of links and things like that. I know we have about 2 minutes left, so we'll do one last question, and this is for you, Della. When noting access to Wi-Fi in rural areas, is the discussion about providing the Wi-Fi, or is it also about making it affordable or even free to the impoverished families that so often live in rural communities?
So I think it's about both. I think it's about, and it's happening on different committees. Like the Commerce Committee is talking about it, but so is the Education and Labor Committee. So in the education world, it's about making sure that students who attend under-resourced schools aren't shortchanged by the lack of access that the school or the community might have. So what sort of community-based solutions can there be to help those students, and where should that money come from? And at the education level, they think it should come from the Department of Education. But the broader conversation at the Commerce Committee and others is what federal interventions are required by what is now considered almost a right to access to the internet and the resources it provides. And those are bigger conversations about, cabling and satellites and all that sort of thing. But I think folks are having the conversation on both levels.
Yeah, from what I learned from my colleague actually just this morning was, I think there's over 250 school districts that still do not have access. And so they are working on addressing what they're calling the homework gap, where, kids that go home don't have access to, usable Wi-Fi or internet access to do homework, which is often required for research and paper development and transmission to their teachers via email. So there's a lot of issues there. I love that idea, Della, about the Wi-Fi buses. So maybe that's something that is maybe not my colleagues. I'll certainly bring it up with them. But yeah, I think we made some strides, but there's still a ways to go.
Yeah, I think we want to continue to share. I want to thank, we are at time a little bit over. I want to thank Teresa, Patti, Della, Veronica. Thank you all again. Thank you to everyone who joined. Patti, not to cut short that conversation, I think we might even have a focus area on that conversation moving forward. So We will address questions that we did not answer today. I just want to thank everyone so much for your time. I hope that you found this as valuable as I did. And with that, Veronica, anything else we should mention before we say goodbye?
That's it. I would say the practice group for computer science is going to be doing an informal webinar with some folks, some guest speakers on June 10th. So watch out for that on your newsletters from STEM Learning Ecosystems as well as on the internal site. Other than that, thank you all so much for your time. Thank you so much, Angela, for leading this conversation, and to STEM Next Opportunity Fund, Patti and Della, for all of your time, and then obviously all of you for your thoughtful contributions and questions. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.